Returning now to the day in politics, and joining me from our Parliament House studio is the Shadow Water Minister, Barnaby Joyce. Senator, tonight the Prime Minister's accused the Coalition of flirting with a strain of economic Hansonism. Are you?
Oh, what a ludicrous statement. The Prime Minister has come out and said that after releasing this report, the Murray-Darling Basin report, spending $100 million on it, and by their own report, the Australian government solicitor, they've only managed to tick one box out of the three they were supposed to address in the report. And she's talking about economic irresponsibility. She's $164 billion in gross debt. She's just finished off the building education revolution stuff-up, which she wasted all that money on. We've also had the ceiling insulation debacle, and she's got the height to talk about economic irresponsibility. She's the personification, and the Labor Party the personification of economic irresponsibility, and it continues on getting worse and worse by the day.
Well, Pauline Hanson advocated protectionism and stronger banking regulation. How is that different to the ideas floated by Andrew Robb and Joe Hockey?
Pauline Hanson supported the Australian flag. How's that different to the Labor Party? I mean, just because someone airs a view doesn't mean that you espouse to all the views that that person has. And this is the sort of glib politics that Ms Gillard is diving towards by reason of her polls, which are plummeting, and they're plummeting because she's completely incompetent.
I don't think the Prime Minister was saying that you hold all the views of Pauline Hanson. She made it clear that she thought that you held the economic views which trend towards protectionism.
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, the fact in the matter is that obviously there are certain sections of the economy which the Australian people have a right to wish that are protected in a form. That's why we have a thing called the Foreign Investment Review Board, and I'm certain as they go down the path of looking at the merger of the stock exchange, we'll see that in action, and we'll see the response from the Australian people. So responding to the desires of the Australian people is hardly protectionism, and if what Mr Gillard is alluding to is Joe Hockey's statements about banks, well, I think the Australian people want somebody to hold the banks to account. And if Joe Hockey is willing to stick up his hand and make sure that the Australian public are getting a fair go, then I think that's something to be commended. Maybe Ms Gillard doesn't believe that. Maybe she believes that the banking industry should be allowed to go hell for leather and touch people as much as they like.
But Australia's banks are some of the most highly regarded and safest in the world. They're already under a very heavy regulation regime. Why should they be subject to any more? Well,
that's this idea that we've suggested re-regulating interest rates is not correct, and it hasn't been stated. What Joe Hockey has clearly stated, though, and as he should, is that we will make sure that we look out for the Australian people to make sure that they get a fair deal. Now, the regulation that the banks have is the reason that we had not the problems that other nations had during the global financial crisis. And might I remind you, as I don't have to, Lee, because you already know, is that those protections were brought in by a coalition government. So what's Ms Gillard proposing, to remove them, is she?
Let me ask you, in your view, do you think that the four big banks have too much power between themselves?
Well, I don't think that's the issue, but I do take note of someone I've had a lot of tussles with in the past, and that's Graham Samuels, who says that there could be the evidence of a lack of competition. That is, they had the capacity to look at one another's rates and match each other's rates. And the issue of competition is one that we have to be very mindful of, especially in such a crucial sector as banking. And it's not just Joe that's saying that, not just me that's saying that, but also Mr Swan is saying that as well. So everybody is mindful of the fact that a market works when there's competition. If there's not competition, if you have an over-centralised market, then you have the capacity for those who participate in that over-centralised market to be exploited. And even, I think, the Treasury has said that there's an oligopolistic nature to the banking sector, and they did that during Senate estimates.
Well, you say there's a capacity for there to be a lack of competition, but do you believe that at the moment there is a lack of competition?
Well, that's to be judged, and we can see that there is...
I'm asking you to judge it.
Well, I would suggest that if a person's rates move lockstep with another institution's rates, then that would seem to show that you have the capacity to move in unison in such a way that doesn't express your own views, but expresses a communal view, and a communal view that works in lockstep together, works in lockstep against the interests of the consumer. If you had a more diverse marketplace and more participants, then you don't see that sort of behaviour existing. The banks are doing a great job, but they also have a very privileged position in that really they're not open to much competition. It's not as if you or I, Lee, can go set up a bank tomorrow.
People do hate it when the banks raise interest rates outside of what the Reserve Bank is doing. What do you think could be done to prevent that?
Well, it's the issues about competition in the marketplace, Lee. What can be done is, and Joe has pointed out some of these things today in his nine steps that he laid forward, that giving greater access for other participants to come into the marketplace and make sure that they keep the banks honest. It's greater oversight by the ACCC to make sure that they are acting in a fair and conscionable way. These are the sort of things. I've always been a great supporter of the Trade Practices Act being able to protect the rights of consumers, and I think that's what people want. It's not a matter of running down the banks, it's making sure that the Australian people get a fair deal, and I think that's only right and proper.
If we can turn to water, you've been calling for possible amendments to the Water Act to ensure that social and economic concerns have equal billing with environmental ones. As we heard before, the government's legal advice released today says that the Act does reflect that. Are you now satisfied that amendments aren't required?
Well, what we've got, though, Lee, is we've got the guide that's come out, and it's only dealt with one of the issues, the environmental issue. Dealt with it remarkably well, but forgotten about the economic and social consequences. Now, the near riots we've had through regional Australia have also expressed that they don't believe that this is dealing with the economic and social consequences, and these people in regional Australia has a right to make sure the economic rug is not pulled out from underneath them. And Australia has a right to make sure that its food basket is protected so that we get access to affordable food and that we have a capacity to feed ourselves.
OK, I'll just, sorry to interrupt you there because we'll go through those issues in some detail in a second, but I just want to ask, nonetheless, are you satisfied that the Water Act currently allows account to be taken of all of those three aspects, social, economic and environmental?
Yeah, but we've just got to put it into place. I mean, it
is in place. That's what I'm saying. The legal advice says that it does do that. I'm asking, do you accept that?
Well, I accept that because we wrote, and I accept that the Minister at the last moment has the capacity to come in and instruct the MDBA what to do. But the fact is, Lee, that when Minister Wong set up this authority, they've come forward with a report that didn't do that. In fact, they've spent $100 million of your money putting up a report that didn't do the job it was supposed to do. Now, that's just complete and utter incompetence.
But what's wrong, though, with looking, first of all, at what environmental flows are required? Because basically, if the river's not healthy, then you've got nothing. The rest of it's a moot point. What's wrong with putting that forward first and then looking at the social and economic factors?
Because that's not their job. I mean, you've got to put it all in the one document. We didn't have a document just to deal with the environmental consequences. It was supposed to deal with the environmental, the economic and the social consequences. Lee, it's only ticked one box. So for $100 million, you've been touched because you've only got 33% of your result. Now, what we've got to make sure is that if we put forward these reports, that we deal with all the issues that the Act says we're supposed to deal with, and you're dead right. The Australian government solicitor and the Act says that you should be dealing with the triple bottom line approach, but we only got one part of it, and that's why we've had these near riots. And so much for a government that was going to look after regional Australia. One of the first things they did was almost pull the economic rug out from regional Australia, and the polls are reflecting that tomorrow in the papers.
Do you agree that the health of the river has to be the central concern? Because if the river's not working, the rest of it's a moot point.
Yeah, but if no one's living there, nobody knows. You've got to make sure that people are still living there, Lee. You've got to make sure there's an economic base. You can't go to the pensioner who's paid their house off in a regional town. Remember, Lee, 2 million people live in the basin. You can't go to someone who's paid off their house over a working life and say to them, sorry, we're just going to completely change the economic fabric of where you live. We're not going to take that into account. We're just going to only look after the environment, and you're going to be left with the providence of your life reflected in a diminished value of your house, or the fact that your business that you bought has gone down the tube, or the fact that the motel you bought is no longer viable, or the fact that you moved there as a school teacher but there's really no reason for you to be there, the services move out. How is that looking after regional Australia?
But do you accept that things have to change?
Oh, and they are, Lee. We put $10 billion on the table at the start, and they are. And we put in process the capacity to buy back water, but we wanted it done in a strategic way, not in the ad hoc way that they did. Example being, such as the purchase of Terrell Station, $23.75 million of your money, and they didn't even inspect the place. If they had, they'd realise it didn't actually deliver water into the river. $300 million off the Calbetza family, and a lot of that was a purchase of air, it wasn't actually the purchase of water. It's incompetence all round, Lee. That's what you get from the Labor government. And today, Minister Burke comes out and says, all we've been left with is confusion. And read that as Labor. Labor is confusion. It is mass confusion.
What do you say to the suggestion that the coalition's stoking people's anger over this for political mileage?
Well, I was in Rome, so unless it was another miracle of Mary MacKillop, it was hard for me to do it from there. But
no, I'm not saying you. Personally, necessarily. I'm suggesting the coalition as a whole.
No, it's a statement of the obvious. People just see their life being flushed down the toilet by an incompetent government. They see the economic capacity of their town being fundamentally affected by a document. They had more to worry about the sovereign risk of a bad government and dodgy decisions than they did from the drought. The Labor government were about to lock in the drought in perpetuity in regional Australia. And of course, that brings the ire of people and that brings their concern. And whether that's St George or whether that's Dirranbandy or whether that's Shepparton or whether that's Mildura or whether that's Berry, all these towns are the same. They're saying, you've got to be fair dinkum. You can't be about to do this to Australia. You can't have the people who stuffed up the ceiling insulation, stuffed up the building education revolution, are stuffing up the NBN, about to stuff up Australia's capacity to feed itself.
On the NBN, the Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull has flagged possible coalition support if the plan goes to the Productivity Commission for a cost-benefit analysis and it gets approval. Would you line up with that?
Mate, if it passes the Productivity Commission, I'll sprout wings and fly around your studio. I mean, the chance of it passing the Productivity Commission, I hope they do. I challenge the Labor Party. Send it to the Productivity Commission. Show us your fortitude, Miss Gillard. You talk about economic responsibility and Hansonism and all this other rubbish. Then have the gumption and the guts to send this your proposal for the NBN to the Productivity Commission. If you've got nothing to hide, Ms Gillard, you've got nothing to worry about.
And to get back to the question, in addition to flying around my studio, would you then agree to support the NBN?
I'll support it. If it passes the Productivity Commission, you got my support. But you know and I know the chance of this $43 billion white elephant passing the Productivity Commission, you've got to remember, we've got to pay for this at the end of the day, Lee. This is not going to be for free. And the only way we pay for it, the money we borrow, the Australian people borrow, which will go on your $164 billion worth of gross debt, is by putting up your taxes. So everybody will get the joy out of knowing that when they get their wage packet and they see the money that comes out, note that a lot of it's going off to the government for bad management, for whoopee decisions.
Well, one of the reasons Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott gave for supporting the Gillard government is that regional Australia so desperately needs high-speed internet. Why are their regions so different to yours? Why could they sign up for that and see the merits of this program, but you don't?
Oh, look, I want a Maserati. It's just the case of whether I can afford it. I mean, there's no doubt that people would love, broadband, and we want to deliver broadband, but you've got to cut the suit to fit the wearer. And you've got to recognise where we are, and you've got to recognise where our nation's debt is. And you've got to be reasonable and prudent and honest with exactly where we are and what we can afford. Now, how are they going to get the return on this investment other than by either jacking up the price of the phone in your house or putting the bill on the taxpayer? I mean, it's the only way we can do it. Now, I believe that we can get an outcome, Lee, without spending so much. And we can get fibre optics to the schools and to the hospitals, to the vital infrastructure, but what they're proposing is fibre optic to every house, and they're proposing the development of a new monopoly, and they're proposing a massive cost to do it, and I don't think you're proposing how we're going to pay for it.
OK. The news poll in tomorrow's Australian newspaper has the two-party preferred figures as 52-48 in favour of the coalition. Does that whet the appetite of coalition MPs, to frustrate as much legislation as possible in the hopes of an early election?
Lee, I was in the chamber tonight and I passed two pieces of legislation, no questions asked. There's lots of legislation that's non-contra and goes through all the time, and that's the process of it. The community focuses on the ones we argue about, and for good reason, because, for instance, if we didn't argue about this ridiculous Murray-Darling Basin Authority plan, then you'd have it, and we would have just flushed, sections of Australia down the toilet. We argue about the things that need to be argued about, and the non-controversial things, we pass every night in Parliament, in doing our job as expediently as we can for the Australian people.
Just finally, the former Prime Minister John Howard had a pair of shoes thrown at him when he was on the Q&A program tonight. Does it surprise you that 3 years after his defeat, more than 3 years, he still attracts such vitriol?
Well, he's a dynamic character. He's one of the greatest prime ministers this nation will ever see. And people who are dynamic and people who have presence will always have the people who love them and the people who dislike them. And every crowd's got a fool, and you had one there in your studio tonight.
Barnaby Joyce, pleasure to have you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Lee.